Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the darkest corners of human history, where stone chambers echo with screams that have been silent for centuries, where iron and wood were shaped into instruments of unimaginable suffering, and where confession was extracted not through truth, but through pain so intense it rewrote reality itself. We're talking about medieval torture, and I promise you, by the time we're done, you'll never complain about a bad day at work again. Before you get too comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy this kind of deeply disturbing, historically accurate content that somehow makes you grateful to be alive in the 21st century. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from, and honestly, whether you'd have survived 5 minutes in a medieval dungeon. I read them all, mostly because I can't sleep either after researching this stuff. Now, dim those lights. Maybe grab a blanket, because we're about to explore what happens when human creativity turns its full attention toward causing pain. Put on a fan for that soft background hum if you need it. Medieval executioners didn't have that luxury, just the drip of watered down stone walls and the creak of wooden wheels turning. Let me paint you a picture. It's the year 1350, somewhere in Central Europe. You're standing outside a castle, or maybe a church basement, and you hear something that makes your blood freeze. It's not a scream exactly, more like a sound that used to be human. The guards at the door don't flinch. They've heard worse. Inside that door is a room designed with a single purpose: to break the human body and spirit so thoroughly that truth becomes whatever the torturer wants to hear. But here's the thing that most people don't understand about medieval torture. It wasn't random cruelty performed by sadists, though certainly some took pleasure in their work. It was systematic, legal, and considered absolutely necessary for justice. The medieval mind operated on principles that seem alien to us now. Confession was king. Without a confession, guilt couldn't be proven, and without proof, the soul couldn't be saved through repentance. So torture became, in the twisted logic of the age, an act of mercy. Break the body to save the soul. Shatter the limbs to free the truth. The torture chamber itself was a carefully designed space. Most were underground, away from the main living areas of castles or tucked beneath churches in grim irony. The walls were thick, sometimes with acoustic considerations to muffle sounds that might disturb the household above. Windowless rooms meant no natural light, just the flicker of torches casting shadows that danced across instruments hanging on walls like tools in a workshop. Which, in a sense, they were. A workshop for human suffering. The floor was often slightly sloped, with channels cut into the stone to drain away blood and other fluids. Hooks were embedded in ceilings for hoisting victims. Heavy wooden beams crossed overhead, strong enough to support the weight of a human body suspended in unnatural positions. The air smelled of old blood, sweat, fear, smoke from torches, and underneath it all, the damp earth smell of stone that never sees sun. Let's talk about who ended up in these chambers and why. The medieval period, roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, saw torture evolve from sporadic use to institutionalized legal procedure. The real acceleration came with the medieval Inquisition, particularly after Pope Innocent IV issued his papal bull Ad Extirpanda in 1252. This document formally authorized the use of torture to extract confessions from suspected heretics, though with certain restrictions that were, in practice, largely ignored. Heresy was the big one. The Catholic Church, feeling threatened by groups like the Cathars in southern France and various other religious movements, needed a way to root out those who challenged official doctrine. But torture wasn't reserved only for religious crimes. Murder, treason, theft, witchcraft, adultery, even stubborn refusal to confess to crimes you may not have committed, all could land you in the torture chamber. The accused were often presumed guilty, and torture served merely to confirm what authorities already believed they knew. The legal framework around medieval torture was surprisingly detailed. There were theoretically rules about who could be tortured, for how long, and how severely. Pregnant women were supposed to be exempt, as were children under a certain age and the elderly. Of course, determining someone's age in an era without birth certificates was conveniently flexible. Nobles could sometimes buy their way out or receive gentler treatment. The poor had no such luxury. Justice, as always, had a price. One of the peculiar aspects of medieval torture law was that technically, you couldn't torture someone twice for the same accusation. Clever torturers got around this by calling subsequent sessions continuations rather than new torture sessions. The victim might be removed from the rack, given a day to consider confessing, then brought back and told this was merely a continuation of yesterday's questioning. Legal fiction at its finest. The roles in a torture chamber were clearly defined. The executioner or torturer was often a city employee, paid a salary and sometimes even provided with housing. It wasn't considered dishonorable work in the way we might imagine. These were skilled positions requiring knowledge of human anatomy, an understanding of how much pain a body could endure before death, and the ability to keep detailed records. Yes, records. Medieval torture was bureaucratic. Every session was documented, confessions were written down, and the results reported to whoever had ordered the interrogation. There were assistants who helped restrain victims, operated pulleys and winches, heated metal implements, and generally assisted in the proceedings. Then there were scribes, sitting off to the side with quill and parchment, recording every word spoken. The presence of religious figures was common too, priests who would pray for the victim's soul, urge them to confess for their own salvation, and sometimes even suggest specific questions to ask or methods to employ. Public torture, as opposed to private interrogation, served a different purpose. It was spectacle, deterrence, and entertainment all rolled into one deeply disturbing package. Executions drew crowds like festivals. People would take the day off work, bring their families, pack lunches, and settle in to watch someone die slowly and painfully. Children were encouraged to attend, the theory being that witnessing the fate of criminals would instill proper moral values. In practice, it probably just traumatized a lot of kids and desensitized them to violence. The psychology of confession under torture is fascinating and horrifying. Modern studies have proven what even Napoleon Bonaparte observed centuries ago. Torture doesn't produce reliable information. People will say anything, confess to anything, implicate anyone if it means the pain stops. They'll confess to crimes that never happened, accuse innocent friends and family members, and invent elaborate details that sound convincing but are entirely fabricated. Medieval authorities knew this on some level, but they didn't care. The confession itself was the goal, not truth. Once someone confessed, they could be punished appropriately, their soul could repent, and social order was maintained. Whether they actually committed the crime was almost beside the point. The system needed confessions to function, and torture provided them. Interestingly, there was variation across Europe in how enthusiastically different regions embraced judicial torture. The Spanish Inquisition became particularly infamous, though some historians argue its reputation was somewhat exaggerated by Protestant propaganda. The Germanic regions developed incredibly detailed legal codes around torture, specifying exactly which methods could be used for which crimes. England, surprisingly, used torture less frequently than continental Europe, relying more on trial by jury, though the Tower of London certainly had its share of racks and other implements. The theological justification for torture was elaborate. Pain was purifying. The body was weak and sinful, but through suffering it could be brought to truth and repentance. St. Augustine and other church fathers had written about the disciplining of the flesh, and medieval torturers took these concepts to their logical, horrifying conclusions. If a little physical discomfort could improve the soul, then surely extreme agony could save it entirely. There was also a strange sort of magical thinking around torture. Some believed that the guilty would confess quickly because God would not allow the innocent to suffer beyond their capacity to bear. If you held out under torture, it might actually be seen as evidence of innocence, though just as often it was interpreted as demonic assistance allowing you to resist. You couldn't win. The economics of torture were substantial. Those elaborate devices we'll discuss, the wheels and racks and iron maidens, they cost money to build and maintain. Cities budgeted for torture equipment the way they budgeted for roads and bridges. Executioners needed to be paid, assistants hired, facilities maintained. There was even a market for used torture devices sold from one jurisdiction to another like any other commercial goods. Some towns became known for their particularly skilled executioners, and these individuals might be borrowed by neighboring jurisdictions for especially important cases. A master torturer could command high fees, and the best developed reputations that spread across regions. Being good at your job, in this case, meant being able to extract confessions quickly while keeping the victim alive and conscious for as long as possible. The rooms where this happened were often surprisingly cold, regardless of season. Stone chambers underground maintained a constant chill. This wasn't accidental. Cold made muscles tense, increased pain sensitivity, and added another layer of misery to an already unbearable situation. In winter, victims might be kept in near-freezing conditions, sometimes doused with cold water to amplify their suffering. Lighting played a role too. Torches and candles created moving shadows, making it hard for victims to see clearly what was happening to them or what was coming next. This uncertainty was its own form of torture. The imagination, when given fragments of information, often conjures worse horrors than reality provides. Medieval torturers understood this psychological principle even if they couldn't articulate it in modern terms. Sound was another tool. The echo of screams in stone chambers, the creak and groan of wooden devices under strain, the metallic clink of chains, all of these sounds built an atmosphere of terror. Victims awaiting their turn could hear what was happening to others, their fear mounting with each scream that penetrated the thick doors. The smell must have been overwhelming. Old blood goes rancid and develops a peculiar sweet sick odor that clings to everything. Add unwashed bodies, the metallic tang of fresh blood, the acrid smell of cauterized flesh when hot irons were used, smoke from torches, and the earthy dampness of underground stone. It created an olfactory assault that signaled to every victim entering the space that this was a place where normal rules didn't apply. Now, before we dive into specific devices and methods, I want you to understand something. These weren't just props from horror movies. These were real tools, used on real people for real reasons that made sense to the people implementing them. The horror isn't just in the physical damage they could inflict, though that was extraordinary. The horror is in the systematic nature of it all, the bureaucracy of suffering, the way torture was integrated into legal and religious systems that millions of people accepted as normal and necessary. Medieval torture represented a worldview fundamentally different from ours. Pain wasn't just a sensation to be avoided. It was a tool, a teacher, a path to truth and salvation. The body was less valuable than the soul, so damaging the body to save the soul was a bargain. Human rights, as we understand them, didn't exist. Individual suffering mattered far less than social order and religious orthodoxy. So, as we explore these methods and devices in detail, remember, this isn't fiction. This isn't exaggeration for effect. This is history. This is what humans did to each other, systematically, legally, and often with the blessing of both church and state for centuries. And understanding this dark chapter of our past is crucial, not because we should dwell in horror, but because we need to remember how far we've come and how vigilant we must remain to never slide backward into accepting torture as normal or necessary. Let the stone walls close in. Let the torches cast their wavering light. Let's walk into the torture chamber and face what awaits there. Your journey through medieval suffering starts now. Picture a large wooden wagon wheel, the kind you'd see on a medieval cart hauling goods to market. Now imagine that wheel transformed into an instrument specifically designed to destroy the human body, piece by piece, in public, while keeping the victim alive and conscious for as long as possible. That's the breaking wheel, and it was one of the most feared devices in all of medieval Europe. The breaking wheel went by many names. Germans called it das Rad. The French knew it as la roue. In English, it was sometimes called the Catherine wheel, named after Saint Catherine of Alexandria, who, according to legend, was sentenced to die on such a device, but was saved when it miraculously broke at her touch. The actual historical victims weren't so fortunate. The device itself was deceptively simple. A large wooden wheel, typically 4 to 6 feet in diameter, with spokes radiating from a central hub. Some wheels were fixed horizontally on a post, others could be stood upright. The surface might be smooth or studded with pegs or iron teeth. The simplicity was part of its effectiveness. You didn't need complex machinery or rare materials. Any wheelwright could construct one, and indeed, they were common enough that most towns of any size possessed at least one. The breaking wheel wasn't a torture device in the sense of extracting confessions. It was an execution method, specifically designed for maximum suffering and maximum spectacle. Reserved for the most serious crimes, murder, treason, particularly heinous theft, being broken on the wheel was considered one of the worst fates that could befall you. And it was meant to be public. The point wasn't just to kill the criminal, it was to traumatize everyone watching into never committing similar crimes. Here's how it worked, and I apologize in advance for the graphic nature of what follows, but understanding the full horror is important. The condemned person would be brought to the execution ground, usually a raised platform so crowds could see clearly. They'd be laid on the ground, and their limbs would be stretched out and positioned across the spokes of the wheel, or sometimes across wooden beams placed beneath them. The arms and legs were positioned so that they lay across gaps in the spokes, with joints, elbows, knees exposed. The executioner would then take up a heavy iron bar, or hammer. Sometimes these tools had names and were passed down through families of executioners like heirlooms. The executioner's job was to systematically break every major bone in the victim's body, starting with the extremities and working inward. First, the fingers might be shattered, then the hands, then the forearms. A skilled executioner knew exactly where to strike to break bones cleanly without causing immediate death. Each strike made a sound that witnesses described as sickening, the crack of bone mixed with the victim's screams. The executioner would work methodically, moving from limb to limb. Wrists, elbows, shoulders, ankles, knees, hips. Ribs would be broken next. The spine might be struck. The number of blows was sometimes specified in the sentence. A merciful sentence might call for only a few strategic strikes that caused quicker death. A harsh sentence could mandate dozens of blows, drawing out the agony for hours. In some variations, after the bones were broken, the still living victim would be woven through the spokes of the wheel. With bones shattered, the limbs became horrifyingly flexible, and they could be threaded through the wheel structure in a grotesque parody of weaving. The wheel would then be hoisted up on a pole and left standing for all to see, the broken body left to die, from a combination of shock, dehydration, and infection. Death was not quick. Historical accounts record people living for days while broken on the wheel. The pain must have been absolutely beyond comprehension. Every involuntary muscle movement, every breath, every slight shift of weight would grind broken bones together and send fresh waves of agony through the nervous system. Add to this the exposure to the elements, the burning sun or freezing rain, the inability to sleep despite exhaustion, the thirst that can't be quenched, and you begin to understand why this was considered the ultimate punishment. Crowds would gather to watch, not just the execution itself, but the dying afterward. Vendors would set up stalls nearby. The execution ground became a temporary fair. People would eat and drink and socialize, while a human being died in unspeakable agony just meters away. Children were brought to learn moral lessons. The whole community participated in this ritualized killing. There were variations depending on region and severity of crime. In France, a particularly harsh version called breaking from below started with the legs and worked upward, maximizing suffering. A merciful version called breaking from above began with a blow to the neck or chest that would cause quicker death. This mercy was sometimes granted to those who confessed their crimes or showed proper repentance, or occasionally it could be purchased by paying the executioner. There were some wheels that had the condemned person tied facing up so they could see each blow coming. Others positioned them face down. There are accounts of executioners missing their strikes, hitting non-lethal areas by accident, prolonging suffering unintentionally. There are also darker accounts of executioners deliberately missing, either because they were incompetent, drunk, or had been paid by someone to maximize the victim's suffering as revenge. The breaking wheel had deep cultural significance. It represented ultimate justice, divine punishment made visible. The public nature of the execution reinforced social hierarchies and the power of those who could order such deaths. Watching someone broken on the wheel reminded everyone of their place and the consequences of stepping out of line. One of the most infamous historical cases involving the breaking wheel was that of Peter Neers in Germany in 1581. Neers was a serial killer, accused of 544 murders over 20 years. After 2 days of preliminary torture to extract every detail of his crimes, he was given 42 strikes with the wheel, before being quartered alive. The sentence was meant to match the perceived enormity of his crimes, and indeed, witnesses reported that the execution was so prolonged and brutal that even hardened spectators turned away in horror. The wheel was also used in the context of rebellion. After the revolt of Horea, Kloschka, and Krishnan in Transylvania in 1785, 2 of the rebellion leaders were sentenced to the breaking wheel. The sentence specified breaking from below, the most painful version, to send a message about the consequences of challenging authority. Krishnan escaped this fate only by hanging himself in his cell before the sentence could be carried out. The practice continued well into what we'd call the early modern period. Johann Patkull, a Livonian gentleman accused of treason by Swedish King Charles XII, was broken on the wheel in 1707. His friend, a priest named Lorenz Hagen, witnessed the execution and left a harrowing account of Patkull's suffering, describing how each blow of the executioner's hammer brought fresh screams and how Patkull remained conscious through most of the ordeal before finally succumbing. Now, let's talk about the boot, sometimes called the Spanish boot, though it was used throughout Europe. This device focused all its cruelty on the lower legs and feet. The victim's legs would be placed in tight metal or wooden casings that fit from ankle to knee. Then, wooden wedges would be hammered into the space between leg and casing, or sometimes the boot itself would have screws that could be tightened. The effect was a gradual crushing of all the small bones in the foot and ankle. The victim would feel their bones compressing, then cracking, then splintering. Flesh would bulge through gaps in the boot as pressure increased. The pain was described as a burning, crushing sensation that radiated up the entire leg. And unlike some forms of torture that could kill relatively quickly, the boot was designed to inflict maximum pain while keeping the victim alive and conscious. The boot was particularly effective because feet contained so many small bones and nerve endings. Crushing them produced intense pain that the victim couldn't distance themselves from psychologically. You could perhaps dissociate from pain happening to your back or arms, but feet are so integral to our sense of balance and movement that damage there feels immediate and inescapable. Variations of the boot included heated versions, where the metal casings would be warmed before application or during use, adding burning to the crushing. Some designs incorporated spikes on the interior that would pierce flesh as the boot tightened. The ingenuity humans applied to causing suffering in this period really was remarkable in the worst possible way. Recovery from the boot, for those who survived, was unlikely. Shattered foot bones rarely healed properly in an era before modern surgery. Victims were often crippled for life, left to beg because they could no longer work. This permanent disability was sometimes part of the punishment's appeal, a lifelong reminder of the price of crime visible to the community. Then there was the scavenger's daughter, an English invention named after its creator, a man named Skevington, who served as lieutenant of the Tower of London. This device worked opposite to the rack. It compressed rather than stretched. The victim would be forced into a kneeling position with their shins folded under them and their thighs pressed against their abdomen. Their arms would be folded over their knees. Then an iron hoop would be placed around their back and another over their shins and back, and a screw mechanism would tighten these hoops together, forcing the body into an increasingly tight ball. The compression caused different but equally horrible effects compared to stretching torture. The victim's ribs would compress their lungs, making breathing almost impossible. Blood flow would be restricted. The spine would be forced into an unnatural curve. Internal organs would be crushed against each other. Blood would sometimes be forced from the nose and ears due to the pressure. The victim's own body weight worked against them, gravity adding to the compression. What made the scavenger's daughter particularly insidious was that it could cause permanent damage very quickly. Prolonged compression could lead to organ damage, broken ribs that pierced lungs, blood clots from restricted circulation, and spinal injuries. Even relatively short sessions could leave victims unable to breathe properly or stand upright for days afterward.
The device was used in the Tower of London through the 16th and 17th centuries, primarily on those accused of treason or religious crimes during the turbulent periods of the English Reformation and Counter-Reformation. Catholic priests hiding in England, Protestant reformers under Catholic monarchs, and political conspirators all potentially faced this device. Bone-crushing torture reflected medieval understanding of human anatomy, which was incomplete but sufficient for their purposes. They knew that certain bones were easier to break than others, that joints were particularly vulnerable, that crushing injuries caused different pain than cuts or burns. They knew that keeping someone alive while causing maximum pain required a certain level of skill and knowledge. The psychological effect of these crushing tortures deserves mention. Unlike devices that cut or burned, which produced acute pain, crushing involved pressure that built slowly. The victim would feel it coming, sense their bones starting to give way, hear the creaking of wood or groan of metal as pressure increased. The anticipation became its own torture, the knowledge that each turn of a screw or hammer blow brought them closer to the breaking point. Medieval medical knowledge, limited as it was, still recognized that broken bones could heal, but often did so improperly without intervention. A broken leg might heal at an angle, leaving the victim with a permanent limp. Crushed fingers might fuse into useless clubs. Shattered joints might never work properly again. These permanent injuries served as visible warnings to others about the cost of crime. The public nature of many bone-crushing punishments meant that the sound of breaking bones became familiar to medieval city dwellers. The crack of the wheel, the crunch of the boot, these sounds would echo across execution grounds and marketplaces, registering in the minds of witnesses as audio reminders of the price of transgression. Religious justifications for these tortures often invoked the idea of bodily suffering as a path to spiritual purification. If the body was broken, perhaps the soul could be set free to confess and repent. If earthly punishment was severe enough, perhaps it would reduce time in purgatory. These theological justifications helped torturers and officials sleep at night, convinced they were doing God's work. The ending of the breaking wheel and similar crushing tortures came gradually, not from humanitarian concern so much as from changing ideas about punishment. As the Enlightenment spread across Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries, voices began arguing that torture was unreliable, that it brutalized society, that it didn't actually deter crime effectively. One by one, jurisdictions moved away from public torture executions toward quicker, more private methods. But the breaking wheel's legacy remained in language and culture. The French word roué originally meant someone broken on the wheel, but came to mean a morally debauched person. In German, radibrechen literally means to break on the wheel, but is used idiomatically to mean speaking incorrectly or mangling language. The wheel left its mark on culture even after the device itself was retired to museums. Those museums, by the way, often display breaking wheels and crushing devices today as historical curiosities. Visitors walk past them with morbid fascination, trying to imagine how they were used, often not fully grasping the reality of what they're seeing. These aren't movie props, they're instruments that actually broke real human bodies. The wood and iron you see in museum displays actually touched broken bones and torn flesh, actually supported the weight of dying people, actually played a role in some of the worst suffering humans have ever inflicted on each other. The lesson of the breaking wheel and its crushing cousins isn't just about historical cruelty. It's about what humans are capable of when we decide that some people are less than human, when we convince ourselves that causing suffering serves a higher purpose, when we turn pain into spectacle and justice into vengeance. The wheels and boots and compression devices didn't operate themselves. People built them, maintained them, used them, watched them in action, and went home to dinner afterward. And that, more than any technical details about breaking points or optimal compression ratios, is what should disturb us most. Not that medieval torture devices existed, but that entire societies organized themselves around their use, considered them necessary, and found ways to sleep at night despite the screaming. If the breaking wheel represented destruction through compression and impact, the rack was its opposite twin, destruction through extension and slow, measured pulling.
The rack has become perhaps the most iconic torture device in popular imagination, the thing people picture when they think of medieval dungeons. And unlike some devices we'll discuss later, the rack was very real, very widely used, and left very detailed historical records of its employment. The Tower of London had its own rack, known colloquially as the Duke of Exeter's daughter, named after John Holland, the second Duke of Exeter, who introduced it to the tower around 1420. The mechanics were elegantly simple, which is what made it so terrible. The victim's ankles and wrists were secured by ropes that passed around axles near the head and foot of the rack. When the axles were turned, slowly, by poles inserted into sockets, the victim's hip, knee, shoulder, and elbow joints would be dislocated. That's the clinical description. The reality was far worse. Let's walk through what actually happened when someone was racked. First, they'd be brought into the torture chamber, often at night, by torchlight. The rack itself would be waiting, a dark wooden framework that looked almost like a bed, if beds were designed by demons. The victim would be shown the device first, given time to imagine what was coming. This psychological preparation was deliberate. Often the sheer sight of the rack was enough for people to surrender and confess without ever being touched by it. If they didn't break at that point, they'd be forced to lie down on the rack's wooden surface. Their wrists would be tied with rope, secured to the roller at the head of the frame. Their ankles would be similarly bound to the roller at the foot. The ropes were tied carefully, tight enough that they couldn't slip free, but not so tight as to cut off circulation immediately. The torturer wanted maximum effect, and that meant the victim needed to be conscious and feeling everything. Then the turning began. An operator, often a yeoman warder if this was in the Tower of London, would insert wooden poles into the sockets of one or both rollers and begin to turn. Slowly. That was crucial. Quick pulling might damage the body too quickly, leading to unconsciousness or death before a confession was extracted. Slow pulling maximized pain while extending the torture session. The first sensation would be tension. The ropes would tighten against wrists and ankles. The body would begin to stretch, feeling uncomfortably extended but not yet painful. This stage might last minutes, the operator turning the rollers incrementally, letting the victim anticipate what was coming. Then the real pain would start. Human joints aren't designed to be pulled apart. As the stretching continued, the spaces between bones would begin to widen. Ligaments and tendons, tough bands of tissue that hold joints together, would start to strain. The pain at this stage has been described as a deep, burning ache that spread throughout the joints and throughout the entire limbs. The victim's shoulders would begin to scream protest, hips and knees joining the chorus. The interrogator would be asking questions constantly. Where are the other conspirators hiding? Who helped you? What were you planning? With each refusal to answer or claim of innocence, the operator would give the rollers another quarter turn. The questions and the turning developed a rhythm, a call and response of agony. As stretching continued, joints would begin to dislocate, shoulders first, typically, as they're more mobile and thus more vulnerable to this kind of stress. The moment of dislocation brought a sound witnesses described as a wet pop, like a cork being pulled from a bottle, but louder and more sickening. The pain at that moment was apparently beyond anything the victim had experienced before, a white-hot flash that often caused unconsciousness. If the victim fainted, cold water would be thrown on them to revive them. The session couldn't continue with an unconscious victim. There'd be no confession, no information gained. So they'd be brought back to consciousness, given a moment to fully register the reality of their dislocated shoulders, and then the questions would resume. If they still refused to talk, the turning continued. Anne Askew, a writer and Protestant preacher, was the only woman known to have been tortured at the Tower. She was charged with heresy and put on the rack to force her to reveal the names of those who shared her beliefs. Her diary, smuggled out of the Tower, recorded her ordeal in stark terms. She wrote that she laid still and did not cry, so the Lord Chancellor and Master Rich took pains to rack her with their own hands until she was near death. The fact that high-ranking officials personally operated the rack shows how desperate they were for her confession. Askew was unable to walk as a result of the torture, so had to be carried to her execution. She was burned at the stake on July 16, 1546. Think about that for a moment. The rack damaged her so severely that even after they stopped stretching her, even after her interrogation ended, she couldn't support her own weight. Her joints never recovered. She was executed while still broken from torture. Hip joints would dislocate next, as stretching continued, then knees, then elbows. With each joint that separated, the body became longer, stretched beyond its natural length by inches. Historical accounts mention victims growing by as much as 6 inches during extreme racking sessions. That extra length represented catastrophic damage to every major joint in the body. But dislocation wasn't the end. If the victims still wouldn't confess, or if their confession wasn't sufficiently detailed, the turning could continue until ligaments and tendons began to tear. This produced a different sound, witnesses said, less of a pop and more of a ripping like fabric being torn.
In the most extreme cases, if torture continued past the point of torn tissues, the actual separation of limbs could occur. This was rare, as it generally meant the victim would die from blood loss and shock, ending the interrogation. But it did happen, particularly in cases where the torturer was either incompetent or so angry at the victim's refusal to confess that they lost control. The physical effects of racking extended beyond just the joints. As the body stretched, the spine would elongate, compressing discs and potentially causing vertebrae to separate. This could lead to spinal cord damage, resulting in paralysis. The The stretching also affected internal organs, pulling them in directions they weren't designed to move, potentially causing internal bleeding or organ damage. Breathing became difficult as the rib cage was stretched. The victim would struggle to draw full breaths, adding suffocation anxiety to the mix of pain. Blood flow to the extremities could be compromised, leading to tingling numbness that alternated with the burning pain of stressed joints. The combination of sensations, burning, tearing, aching, tingling, sharp stabbing pain, was overwhelming. Guy Fawkes is thought to have been tortured on the rack during his interrogation at the Tower after the Gunpowder Plot of 1605. While we don't have Fawkes' own account, we do have his signatures from before and after torture. The difference is stark. His signature before torture is confident, clear, flowing. His signature after shows a shaky, barely legible scrawl. His hand had been so damaged by the stretching that he could barely hold a quill. John Gerard, a Jesuit priest arrested in the 1590s, wrote a detailed account of his torture experience. While his description focuses on being suspended by manacles rather than the rack proper, it illustrates the principle of stretching torture. He described being placed in iron gauntlets, made to climb steps, then having his arms lifted and suspended from an iron bar. When the steps were removed, he was left hanging by his hands and arms fastened above his head. Gerard's account is particularly valuable because he describes not just the physical sensation, but the psychological experience. He wrote about the moment when his full weight transferred to his wrists, the instant realization that there was no relief coming, that gravity itself had become his enemy. He described how quickly his arms began to go numb, then how the numbness was replaced by a fire-like burning that spread through his shoulders. He talked about trying to find positions that eased the pain, even fractionally, only to discover there were none. The duration of rack sessions varied. Some victims were stretched for hours. Others, like Anne Askew, endured multiple sessions over several days. Between sessions, victims would be returned to cells, their dislocated joints left unset, the pain constant and inescapable. The threat of being brought back to the rack hung over them, a promise that the agony could always get worse. Recovery from racking, for those who survived, was a long and often incomplete process. Dislocated joints, if set properly, could sometimes heal, though they'd remain weak and prone to future dislocation. Torn ligaments and tendons often didn't heal correctly, leaving permanent limitations in range of motion. Nerve damage from stretched and compressed spinal cords could cause lifelong pain or numbness. Many rack survivors were left unable to work, couldn't perform the physical labor that most medieval jobs required. They might be able to walk, but not well. They might retain use of their arms, but without the strength or flexibility they once had. They became visible warnings to others about the price of defiance. Broken people, living testimonies to the power of the state and church. The rack wasn't alone in the category of stretching tortures. The strappadato was another method, simpler and more portable. The victim's hands would be tied behind their back, and they'd be hoisted into the air by a rope attached to their bound wrists. Their own body weight would pull their shoulders backward and upward, a position that quickly became excruciating. Strappadato could be enhanced by adding weights to the victim's feet, increasing the downward pull. Or the victim could be dropped suddenly, the rope catching them mid-fall. This jerking motion would dislocate shoulders almost instantly, the snap audible across a room. Strappadato had the advantage of portability. It required only a rope and a high beam or tree branch. It could be performed outdoors, publicly, turning torture into civic spectacle. Another stretching device, less well known but equally horrible, was the Judas cradle. This was a pyramid-shaped seat, pointed at the top. The victim would be suspended above it, usually by chains attached to a belt or harness around their waist. Then they'd be slowly lowered onto the point of the pyramid.
The point would press into the victim's perineum. the area between genitals and anus, or into the anus itself. The stretching came from the victim's instinct to raise themselves off the point, pulling up with their leg muscles, straining against the chains. But eventually, exhaustion would set in, and they'd lower back onto the point. This cycle of pulling up and sinking down would continue for hours, the leg muscles going through extension and contraction until they gave out entirely. The Judas cradle combined stretching with piercing and crushing, a trifecta of torments. The point could cause internal damage, perforating intestines or causing severe bleeding. The stretching of leg muscles led to tearing and permanent damage. And the psychological torture of having to choose between active pain, pulling up, and passive agony, sinking down, added another layer of horror. All these stretching methods shared a common feature. They turned the victim's own body against them. Gravity, muscle tension, the simple mechanics of joints and leverage all became weapons. The torture didn't require elaborate machinery or expensive materials. It just required an understanding of how bodies work and a willingness to exploit their vulnerabilities. The medical understanding of why stretching hurt so much was limited in medieval times, but torturers knew empirically what worked. They knew that pulling limbs in opposite directions caused pain. They knew that holding someone in an unnatural position for extended periods caused agony. They didn't need to understand the mechanics of ligaments or the neural pathways of pain. They just needed to observe and remember what techniques produced confessions. Modern medical science has since explained what was happening. When joints are forced beyond their normal range of motion, the protective mechanisms that usually prevent damage are overridden. Ligaments, which are slightly elastic but have limits, are stretched past those limits. Micro tears occur in the tissue, each one a tiny injury that the brain interprets as pain. Continued stretching turns micro tears into full ruptures. Nerve endings in joints are particularly dense, designed to give us precise feedback about position and movement. When joints are damaged, those nerve endings send distress signals at maximum intensity. The brain, receiving this flood of pain signals from multiple joints simultaneously, can't process it all. This sensory overload is part of why torture victims often couldn't form coherent thoughts or resist interrogation effectively. The psychological impact of stretching torture was also significant. Unlike being struck or burned, which produced acute pain that might fade between blows, stretching produced a constant building pain that never fully stopped. There was no moment of relief, no pause to gather strength. The agony was unrelenting, increasing second by second, until the victim would literally say or do anything to make it stop. This is why torture, particularly stretching torture, was so effective at producing confessions, and why those confessions were so unreliable. A person being slowly pulled apart isn't thinking clearly. They're not carefully considering their options or trying to protect their co-conspirators. They're experiencing pain that overrides every other consideration, and they'll confess to whatever the interrogator wants to hear if there's any chance it might stop the stretching. Medieval authorities knew this, on some level. There are records of officials questioning confessions obtained under torture, noting that victims would recant once the pain stopped. But the legal system of the time required confessions for conviction, and torture provided those confessions. So it continued, despite its obvious flaws, because it served the needs of those in power. The rack and its stretching cousins were eventually retired not because people suddenly developed humanitarian concerns, but because the Enlightenment brought new ideas about legal evidence and the unreliability of torture-induced confessions. Writers like Cesare Beccaria argued that torture was not only cruel but also ineffective, that it punished the innocent who couldn't endure pain, while potentially letting guilty but physically strong suspects go free. Following criticism that torture was not only cruel but ineffective, as a prisoner on the rack would say anything in order to be freed, torture in the Tower of London was abandoned from the mid-17th century onward. Other jurisdictions followed suit over the next century, though some places held on to judicial torture longer than others. Today, racks exist in museums, displayed behind velvet ropes with placards explaining their historical use. The Tower of London has a replica rack that tourists can photograph, a macabre souvenir of their visit. But standing in front of that replica, even knowing it's never been used, still produces a visceral reaction. The mechanism is too clearly designed for human bodies. The purpose is too obvious. It's impossible to look at it without imagining how it would feel, and flinching from that imagination.
The lesson of the rack isn't just that humans once did terrible things to each other. It's that they did those things systematically, legally, with official sanction and detailed record-keeping. The rack was operated by government employees, in government facilities with government approval. The confessions it produced were used in official courts, recorded in official documents, and treated as legitimate evidence. The horror isn't just in the device itself. It's in the entire system that made such devices normal, acceptable, necessary. And understanding that system, understanding how ordinary people could participate in extraordinary cruelty, is crucial if we want to prevent similar horrors in the future. The rack stretched bodies, but the system that created and used the rack stretched morality, stretched justice, stretched the definitions of acceptable behavior until atrocity became routine. And that's perhaps the most frightening legacy of all. If stretching torture destroyed the body through extension, fire torture destroyed it through elemental force. Throughout human history, fire has held a dual nature: the warmth of hearth and home, and the consuming flame that devours everything it touches. Medieval torturers understood this duality and exploited it fully, creating methods of torment that used heat in its most agonizing forms. The most infamous fire-based torture device is the brazen bull, though its medieval use is somewhat debated. The concept allegedly originated in ancient Greece, but medieval Europe certainly knew of it and may have employed similar devices. Picture a life-sized bronze or brass statue of a bull, hollow inside. The victim would be placed inside through a door in the animal's side. Then a fire would be lit beneath the bull, gradually heating the metal. As the bronze heated, the victim inside would begin to cook. The metal would conduct heat efficiently, turning the interior into an oven. The victim's screams would resonate through tubes in the bull's throat, emerging as bellowing sounds that amused spectators while disguising the human suffering behind them. The acoustic design was intentionally cruel, turning agony into entertainment, human screams into animal sounds. The physics of this torture were particularly horrible. Bronze and brass conduct heat well, so the interior would heat quickly and evenly. There'd be no cool spots to press against, no relief from the building temperature. The air inside would heat up too, making each breath painful. As the temperature rose, the victim would experience the progression from uncomfortable warmth to burning pain to actual cooking. First-degree burns would appear on skin pressed against the metal. Then second-degree burns as tissue began to blister. Third-degree burns as the full thickness of skin was destroyed. If the fire continued, the body would quite literally begin to roast, fat rendering, flesh charring, the smell of cooking meat filling the air. And through it all, the victim would remain conscious for far longer than you'd think possible, their screams emerging as the bull's bellows. The brazen bull, if it was used in medieval times, represented the ultimate in performative torture. It was spectacular, unprecedented in its cruelty, and sent a clear message about power and punishment. But it was also impractical. Bronze casting was expensive. Building a life-sized hollow bowl required skilled craftsmen, and it was permanent, single-purpose, not easily portable. More common were simpler applications of heat and fire. Hot metal pokers or brands were standard equipment in torture chambers. These iron rods would be heated in braziers until they glowed red or even white with heat. Then they'd be applied to the victim's body, burning flesh wherever they touched. The torturers could control exactly where burns occurred. Feet were common targets, as were hands. The agony was immediate and intense. Hot metal cauterizes as it burns, sealing blood vessels as it destroys tissue. The smell of burning flesh is distinctive, sweet and sickening, and it would linger in the torture chamber long after the session ended. Branding served a dual purpose. It caused immediate pain, obviously, but it also left permanent scars that marked the victim. Someone branded on the face or hand carried visible evidence of their crime wherever they went. They were marked for life, unable to hide what they'd done or what had been done to them. The scarring was both punishment and identifier, turning the victim into a walking warning. Some brandings were simple marks, just a burn scar in the shape of a letter or symbol, but others were more elaborate, like the fleur-de-lis brand used in France on convicted criminals, or the T for thief in some English jurisdictions. These marks were designed to be recognizable, so anyone could identify a criminal at a glance. The pain of branding, while intense, was relatively brief compared to other forms of torture. The actual application of the hot iron might only take seconds, but the healing process was agonizing as burned tissue became infected, formed scabs, and eventually scarred. In an era before antibiotics, infected burns often turned septic, spreading through the body and causing fever, delirium, and sometimes death. Burning at the stake was reserved for the most serious offenses, particularly heresy and witchcraft. This wasn't torture in the interrogatory sense, it was execution. But it was execution designed to cause maximum suffering while serving as public spectacle. The condemned would be tied to a stake, often with chains rather than ropes, since ropes would burn through. Wood and kindling would be piled around their feet, and then the fire would be lit. The crowd would watch as flames climbed higher, smoke obscuring the victim, the smell of burning flesh spreading across the execution ground. Death could come from several causes. If the victim was lucky, smoke inhalation would cause unconsciousness before the flames reached them. If not, they might remain conscious as fire consumed their body from the feet up. Some jurisdictions showed mercy by allowing executioners to strangle victims before the fire took full effect, or by placing bags of gunpowder around the victim's neck that would explode and cause quick death once the flames reached them. But this mercy was granted inconsistently and often had to be paid for. Those who couldn't afford it or whose crimes were deemed particularly heinous got no such relief.
Anne Askew, whom we discussed being tortured on the rack, was eventually burned at the stake. She was so damaged from her time on the rack that she had to be carried to her execution on a chair. The fact that authorities would rack someone until they couldn't walk, then burn them to death, illustrates the layered cruelty of medieval justice. Heated metal chairs or thrones represent another category of fire torture. These devices varied in design, but the principle was consistent. The victim would be forced to sit on a metal seat that was heated from below, sometimes to the point of glowing. The combination of being unable to escape, usually they were chained in place, and the gradual increase in heat made this particularly agonizing. The victim would feel the warmth building, knowing what was coming but unable to prevent it. As temperature rose, their clothes would smolder, then ignite. The skin of their buttocks and thighs would burn, sticking to the hot metal. They might thrash against their restraints, but that would only press other parts of their body against heated metal surfaces, spreading the burns. Witnesses to such torture described the sounds: the sizzle of flesh against hot metal, the screams of the victim, sometimes the crackle of burning fabric or hair. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of burning textiles, charring flesh, and rendered fat. It was a smell that no one could mistake for anything other than what it was. The Spanish donkey, despite its name, wasn't Spanish in origin and wasn't particularly associated with any one region. It consisted of a sharp-edged beam, like an inverted V or the peak of a roof. The victim would be placed astride this beam, their weight resting on the sharp edge that pressed into their groin and perineum. Then, often weights would be attached to their feet, adding downward pressure. This device combined heat torture when the beam was heated, which was common. The victim would sit on this sharp, hot edge, their most sensitive areas being simultaneously crushed and burned.
Their own weight became the enemy, gravity pulling them down onto the burning edge. If they tried to lift themselves off with their leg muscles, exhaustion would eventually force them back down. There was no escape, no position that offered relief. The duration of Spanish donkey torture varied, but even relatively short sessions caused severe damage. The pressure combined with heat could cause burns that extended deep into tissue, damaging not just skin, but underlying structures. The groin and perineum contain major blood vessels and nerves, and damage there could cause permanent disability. Fire torture tapped into primal fears. Humans have instinctive terror of burning, hardwired fear that kicks in when we get too close to flames. Medieval torturers exploited this fear deliberately. Often victims would be shown hot irons or burning coals before interrogation even began. The threat of burning was often enough to produce confessions. This threat was made more effective by the smell. Torture chambers where fire methods were used would reek of past burnings. The scent of charred flesh permeated wood and stone, a permanent olfactory reminder of what awaited those who didn't cooperate. New victims brought into such chambers would smell that scent and know immediately what it meant. The religious symbolism of fire torture can't be ignored. Fire was seen as purifying in medieval theology. Burning could cleanse sin, metaphorically speaking. Burning heretics at the stake wasn't just about killing them. It was about purifying their corrupted souls through flame, sending them to God's judgment already partially cleansed by earthly fire. This theological justification made fire torture particularly common for religious crimes. Heretics, witches, those accused of unholy practices, they faced burning more often than other criminals. The fire was seen as appropriate to the nature of their sin, fighting spiritual corruption with elemental purification. The Church's relationship with fire torture was complex. While church courts couldn't shed blood directly, that was forbidden by canon law, they could turn convicted heretics over to secular authorities for burning. This semantic dodge allowed religious officials to condemn people to fiery death while technically keeping their hands clean. The medieval legal concept of relaxation to the secular arm meant turning someone over to be executed, everyone understanding what that meant, but no one saying it directly. Witch burnings, which peaked in the early modern period but had medieval antecedents, took fire torture to industrial scale. Thousands of people, mostly women, were burned alive after being accused of witchcraft. The accusations were often based on confessions extracted through torture, creating a horrific feedback loop. Torture produced false confessions of witchcraft, which led to burnings, which intensified the witch panic, which led to more accusations and more torture. The last official witch burning in Europe occurred in Poland in 1793. Though unofficial burnings continued sporadically for decades after. The practice's centuries-long persistence shows how deeply embedded fire as punishment became in European legal and religious culture. Physical recovery from burn torture for those who survived was exceptionally difficult. Burns are among the most painful injuries human flesh can sustain. The nerve damage causes agonizing pain that can persist for months or years. Burned skin doesn't regenerate properly. It forms thick scar tissue that's tight, inflexible, and often disfiguring. Infection was nearly inevitable with medieval burn treatment. With no understanding of germ theory and limited antiseptic treatments, burned tissue became a breeding ground for bacteria. Gangrene could set in, requiring amputation of affected limbs. Blood poisoning could spread through the body, causing fever, delirium, and death. The psychological scars of burn torture were equally severe. Survivors often developed lifelong terror of fire in any form. A simple hearth fire could trigger panic attacks. The smell of cooking meat might cause nausea or flashbacks. Many burn torture survivors preferred execution to living with the physical and psychological consequences of their ordeal. Fire torture's public nature added to its psychological impact. Burnings at the stake were attended by thousands. The crowd's reaction, cheering or praying, or simply watching with morbid fascination, became part of the victim's final experience. Dying alone in agony would be terrible enough. Dying while surrounded by spectators who were there to witness your suffering as entertainment added another layer of horror. Children were often brought to watch burnings, supposedly to learn moral lessons. In practice, this meant generations of people grew up having witnessed human beings burning alive, having heard the screams, smelled the burning flesh, seen the body consumed by flames. The trauma this caused doesn't appear in historical records, but it must have been significant.
The economics of fire torture were simpler than some other methods. Fire itself was cheap. Wood was plentiful. Metal could be heated in any brazier. Unlike elaborate devices that required skilled craftsmen to build and maintain, fire torture required minimal infrastructure. This accessibility made it widespread. Regional variations existed in how fire was employed. Southern European countries, with their stronger sunlight and hotter climates, sometimes used heat torture that involved leaving victims exposed to the sun, tied in positions that maximized solar exposure. This slow burning could cause severe dehydration and heat stroke along with sunburn. In northern climates, the contrast between fire torture and freezing alternatives was stark. A victim might be burned with hot irons one day and left in freezing cells the next, the temperature extremes magnifying each other's effects. The body never had time to adjust or recover. It was constantly assaulted by environmental extremes. The ending of fire torture as a judicial practice came gradually, as with other forms of torture. Enlightenment thinkers began questioning not just the efficacy of torture, but also its moral basis. The last official execution by burning in England occurred in 1789. France ended the practice after the Revolution. Other European countries followed throughout the 19th century. But the memory of fire torture lingered, encoded in language and culture. Being burned at the stake became metaphorical shorthand for being publicly destroyed or condemned. The phrase trial by fire referred originally to literal tests involving handling hot iron, but evolved to mean any severe test of character or ability. Today, we tend to think of fire torture as particularly barbaric, more cruel somehow than other forms. This probably reflects our modern relationship with fire. We use it safely, contained in furnaces and stoves, kept carefully controlled. The idea of fire as a weapon, as tool of torment, feels more foreign to us than perhaps bladed or crushing weapons do. But for medieval people, fire was ever-present and always dangerous. House fires were common. Cities regularly burned. Fire was a constant threat and a constant tool. Using it for torture was a natural extension of its role in daily life, taking something familiar and turning it into an instrument of suffering. The lesson of fire torture, like all medieval torture, is about the human capacity for cruelty when it's officially sanctioned and culturally normalized. The people who built the pyres, who heated the irons, who applied the brands, they weren't monsters. They were ordinary people doing jobs that their society told them were necessary and right. And that's perhaps the most unsettling truth of all. Given the right circumstances, the right cultural conditioning, the right legal framework, ordinary humans can commit extraordinary cruelty. The flames that consumed heretics and criminals in medieval Europe were lit by hands that then went home to dinner, that held children, that prayed in churches. The capacity for both compassion and atrocity exists in all of us, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. Fire burns,
But the burning questions fire torture raises about human nature continue to smolder centuries after the last official burning. How do ordinary people become torturers? How do societies normalize atrocity? How do we ensure it never happens again? These questions don't have easy answers, but asking them, confronting the reality of what humans have done to each other, is necessary if we want to prevent history from repeating itself. The fires have been extinguished. The memory remains, and should remain, as a warning and reminder. Not all medieval torture involved dramatic devices or spectacular public displays. Some of the most effective and cruelest methods worked slowly, quietly, breaking victims psychologically before their bodies gave out. These were the tortures of anticipation, isolation, sensory deprivation, and gradual degradation that could reduce a person to a shell of themselves without leaving obvious marks. Let's start with the Iron Maiden, perhaps the most misunderstood torture device in popular imagination. You've probably seen it in movies or museums, an upright iron sarcophagus in the shape of a woman with spikes lining the interior. The victim would be placed inside, and the doors would close, driving the spikes into her body. It's a horrifying image and completely fictional for the medieval period. There's no evidence of an Iron Maiden existing before the 1800s. The myth that Iron Maidens existed during the Middle Ages was likely spread by German philosopher Johann Philipp Schiebenkees in the late 18th century, who wrote about how a coin forger in Nuremberg was executed with one in 1515. The first known Iron Maidens were constructed in the 19th century and passed off in museums as medieval torture devices, perpetuating the myth of particularly barbaric Dark Ages. This doesn't mean medieval people were less cruel, just that they had different methods. The Iron Maiden myth tells us more about 19th century attitudes toward the medieval period than about actual medieval practices. It reflects a Victorian fascination with Gothic horror and a desire to contrast enlightened modern times with supposedly barbaric past centuries. But let's talk about real psychological tortures that actually were used. The thumbscrew was a real and common torture device used throughout medieval and early modern Europe. It consisted of a simple vice mechanism that would slowly crush the victim's fingers or toes.
What made thumbscrews particularly effective wasn't just the physical pain, though that was extreme, but the psychological element of watching your own digits being slowly destroyed. The thumbscrew was also called thumbkin or thumaikin, and variants existed for different body parts, including knee crushers and even head crushers, all commonly employed during Inquisition episodes. Picture being brought into an interrogation room and shown this small, unassuming device. It doesn't look particularly frightening at first. Then your finger or thumb is placed between the plates and the screw begins to turn. The pain builds gradually. At first, it's just uncomfortable pressure. Then it becomes a deep, aching throb. As the screw continues turning, the pressure intensifies until bones begin to compress. The crushing could lead to broken bones and torn tendons, causing permanent damage to the victim's hands. The process was slow enough that you felt every stage, had time to anticipate each turn of the screw, could imagine your bones splintering before it actually happened. Thumbscrews were sometimes lined with sharp metal points to puncture the nails, and some variants could accommodate all 10 toes or all fingers of one hand simultaneously. The device's portability was part of its effectiveness. Unlike the rack or the breaking wheel, thumbscrews could be used anywhere, anytime. They were the torture device of choice for those who needed to extract confessions quickly without elaborate setups. One historically documented case shows the psychological impact of these devices. In 1612, painter Artemisia Gentileschi was tortured with thumbscrews during a rape trial. She was being cross-examined under torture for 5 months, yet even while her fingers were being crushed, she maintained her testimony, telling the court repeatedly, "It is true, it is true, it is true." The fact that she endured this and continued to create art afterward speaks to both the horror of what was done to her and the incredible strength of will some victims possessed. The psychological torture of the thumbscrew extended beyond the session itself. Victims whose fingers were crushed often lost the ability to perform fine motor tasks permanently. A craftsman whose hands were destroyed couldn't practice their trade. A scribe couldn't write. The torture damaged not just the body, but the victim's entire future, their ability to earn a living, their place in society. Now let's discuss rat torture, one of the most psychologically devastating methods ever devised. The principle was simple and horrifying. A cage or tube containing hungry rats would be placed against the victim's body, usually their stomach or chest. Then heat would be applied to the far end of the cage, often by placing hot coals on top. The rats, desperate to escape the heat, would have only one direction to go: through the victim. The psychological terror of this method can barely be imagined. You would be restrained, unable to move, and forced to watch as the cage was positioned and secured. You would hear the rats scrambling, sense their panic as heat was applied. Then you would feel them beginning to dig, their claws and teeth working frantically at your flesh, burrowing into your abdomen in their desperate attempt to escape the heat. The pain would be unlike anything else we've discussed. Not the sharp pain of a blade or the crushing pressure of breaking bones, but a tearing, gnawing sensation as living creatures ate their way into your body. The psychological component, knowing that animals were consuming you alive, would be as terrible as the physical agony. And it would be slow. Rats don't tunnel quickly through human flesh. The torture could last hours. Historical records of rat torture are somewhat unclear about its prevalence. It appears more frequently in later periods and may have been more threatened than actually employed, as the threat alone was often sufficient to extract confessions. But enough documented cases exist to confirm it was used, particularly in Dutch territories during the revolt against Spanish rule in the 16th century.
The Chinese water torture, as it came to be known though it was used in Europe as well, worked by sensory overload. Each drop was a small stimulus, but the brain couldn't tune it out. The irregular timing, never quite predictable, kept the victim in a constant state of anticipation. Sleep became impossible. Time lost all meaning. The victim's entire world shrank to that single point on their forehead where the next drop would fall. Dunking, or ducking, was both torture and trial. The victim would be tied to a chair or frame and repeatedly submerged in water. This was most famously used in witch trials. If the victim didn't drown, they might be declared guilty. If they did drown, they were posthumously declared innocent. It was a lose-lose situation wrapped in the guise of divine judgment. The physical danger was real. People could and did drown during ducking. But even those who survived suffered psychological trauma. The terror of feeling water close over your head, the panic as your breath runs out, the desperate gasping when you surface only to be plunged under again. This cycle repeated until confession or unconsciousness would break almost anyone. Sleep deprivation was perhaps the most insidious torture because it required no devices at all, just vigilance. The victim would be kept awake for days, sometimes weeks. Guards would prod them awake whenever they started to drift off. Noise would be made constantly. If the victim was in a cell, lights would be kept burning. In some cases, they might be forced to stand or sit in uncomfortable positions that made sleep physically impossible. The effects of sleep deprivation are well documented now, but were empirically understood even in medieval times. After the first day, concentration becomes difficult. After 2 days, microsleeps begin, brief moments where the brain shuts down involuntarily. By 3 days, hallucinations start. After a week without sleep, the victim's grip on reality becomes tenuous at best. Confessions extracted through sleep deprivation were particularly unreliable, even by torture standards. The victim might confess to anything, might not even remember confessing. might invent elaborate false narratives that seemed real in their sleep-deprived state. But sleep deprivation had the advantage of leaving no marks, no visible evidence of torture, which made it appealing to interrogators who wanted to maintain appearances of lawful procedure. Sensory deprivation worked the opposite way. Instead of constant stimulation, the victim would be placed in complete darkness and silence. Medieval dungeons, dug deep into stone foundations, could be absolutely lightless and sound-dampened. A person placed in such a space would lose all sense of time, all external reference points. The mind, deprived of sensory input, would begin to generate its own. Hallucinations in complete darkness and silence are common and well documented. The victim might see lights that aren't there, hear voices, feel touches on their skin. They might lose sense of their own body's boundaries, unsure where they end and the darkness begins. Time becomes meaningless. Hours feel like days, days like hours. The isolation and confusion could drive people to madness far more effectively than physical pain. Coffin torture combined claustrophobia, sensory deprivation, and physical restraint. The victim would be placed in a coffin-sized box, sometimes an actual coffin, and left there for extended periods. They couldn't stand, could barely move, were surrounded by darkness. The psychological weight of being in a coffin, the cultural association with death, added extra psychological pressure. In some variations, the coffin would be hung in public, perhaps from gallows or castle walls. The victim would be visible through bars or holes, but unable to communicate effectively with passers-by. They would soil themselves, unable to maintain hygiene. Thirst and hunger would mount. The public nature of the humiliation added a social dimension to the torture. Everyone could see you reduced to this state, your dignity stripped away. Public humiliation was itself a form of psychological torture. The stocks and pillory locked victims in place in town squares or market areas where they could be mocked, spat upon, pelted with garbage or stones. The physical discomfort of being locked in an awkward position was real, but the psychological damage of being publicly degraded, of losing all social standing, of becoming an object of derision and entertainment, that often cut deeper than physical pain.
Women accused of crimes, particularly those related to sexuality or speech, faced gender-specific humiliation tortures. The scold's bridle, or branx, was an iron mask that fit over the head with a metal plate or spike that went into the mouth, preventing speech. Women deemed too talkative, too argumentative, or too independent might be forced to wear this device in public, their silence enforced, and their humiliation complete. The branx didn't cause physical damage the way many torture devices did, but the psychological impact was profound. Being silenced, having your voice literally taken away, being paraded through streets in this contraption while neighbors jeered, this attacked a woman's sense of self and social identity in ways that left lasting scars. Ducking stools, specifically for women accused of being scolds, worked similarly. The woman would be strapped to a chair attached to a lever and repeatedly dunked in a river or pond while crowds watched and laughed. The cold water, the gasping for breath, the loss of dignity, all combined to break the victim's spirit. And it was public, making every woman in the community aware of what could happen if they stepped out of line. Pregnancy offered some protection from certain tortures, but not all. Pregnant women could be held in dungeons under terrible conditions, could be subjected to psychological tortures, and in some cases were tortured after giving birth. The threat to an unborn child could itself be a form of torture, forcing a pregnant woman to confess to protect her baby. These psychological and slow tortures shared common features. They broke victims down gradually, attacking not just the body, but the mind and soul. They were often less visible than dramatic devices like the rack, which gave authorities plausible deniability. They could be prolonged almost indefinitely, whereas physical torture had natural limits imposed by the body's structural integrity.
The combination of psychological and physical torture was particularly effective. A victim who'd been sleep-deprived for days, kept in darkness, denied food and water, they'd be far more susceptible to physical torture when it came. Their resistance would already be worn down, their ability to think clearly would be compromised, they'd be more likely to confess and less likely to recant later. Medieval understanding of psychology was primitive by modern standards, but torturers understood empirically that the mind could be broken like the body. They understood that anticipation amplified pain, that isolation eroded resistance, that humiliation stripped dignity. They might not have had the vocabulary of modern psychology, but they knew how to use these principles effectively. The long-term effects of psychological torture often exceeded those of physical torture. A person whose fingers were broken might heal, though imperfectly, but someone who'd been driven to the edge of madness through sleep deprivation or sensory isolation, who'd been publicly humiliated and socially destroyed, they might never recover their former psychological stability or social standing. Survivors of these tortures often displayed what we'd now recognize as symptoms of PTSD: recurring nightmares, hypervigilance, inability to trust others, depression, anxiety. Medieval sources occasionally note victims who never spoke again after torture, who withdrew from society, who seemed to have had their spirits broken even if their bodies survived. The goal of psychological torture wasn't always confession. Sometimes it was simply to destroy the person, to make an example so complete that others would never dare similar resistance. A person broken psychologically, reduced to a shadow of themselves, served as a more effective warning than a corpse. They were a living testament to what happened when you challenged authority. The Church's involvement in psychological torture was particularly significant. Many methods that didn't shed blood, like the branks or dunking or sensory deprivation, were favored by religious authorities who were theoretically forbidden from causing bloodshed. The distinction was semantic, the suffering was real, but it allowed church officials to maintain the fiction of clean hands while still extracting confessions and enforcing orthodoxy. Records of psychological torture are less complete than records of physical torture because they left fewer visible traces. A person released from a dungeon after weeks of darkness and isolation might look thin and shaken, but wouldn't bear the obvious marks of the rack or wheel. This made psychological methods appealing to authorities who wanted to avoid criticism while still breaking suspects.
The ending of these practices, like ending physical torture, came gradually and incompletely. Sleep deprivation continued in various forms well into the 20th century and beyond. Public humiliation punishments persisted longer than physical torture in many jurisdictions. The psychological techniques developed in medieval dungeons evolved rather than disappeared, sometimes finding new applications in modern contexts that are beyond our scope here. The lesson of psychological torture is that you don't need elaborate devices to break a human being. Darkness, water, time, public scorn, sleep deprivation. These simple things, when used deliberately to cause suffering, can be as destructive as any wheel or rack. The victim's own mind becomes the torture chamber, their thoughts and fears the instruments of torment. Understanding these methods matters because they're the ones most likely to leave official records looking clean. When we study torture, we tend to focus on the spectacular devices, the ones that seem medieval and barbaric. But the quiet tortures, the psychological breaking, these techniques have persisted precisely because they're harder to document, easier to deny, and leave victims who might be dismissed as weak or mentally unstable rather than traumatized. Medieval torture chambers held more than racks and wheels. They held darkness and water and time. They held the knowledge that the human mind, given the right pressures, will fracture. And that knowledge, unlike the iron devices, has never really been retired. It's just been refined. Let's talk about what happened after. Most discussions of medieval torture focus on the techniques and devices, on the immediate horror of the torture chamber. But what happened to those who survived?
What were the physical, psychological, and social consequences of being tortured? And what can we learn from this dark period of history that remains relevant today? Physical survival after serious torture was far from guaranteed. Even if the torture session itself didn't kill you, the aftermath easily could. Medieval medicine had no concept of germ theory, no antibiotics, no real understanding of infection or how to prevent it. Any break in the skin, from the rack's rope burns to the wheel's broken bones to burn injuries from hot irons, was a potential entry point for bacteria. Infection was the primary killer of torture survivors. A relatively minor injury could become septic within days. The victim would develop fever, delirium, their wound would ooze pus, red streaks would spread from the injury site as the infection traveled through their bloodstream. Without intervention that medieval medicine couldn't provide, blood poisoning would kill them within a week or two of their torture ending. Those tortured on the rack faced specific complications. Dislocated joints, even if set, rarely healed properly. The ligaments and tendons that held joints together were stretched beyond their capacity to snap back. A shoulder might be set back into its socket, but it would remain loose, prone to dislocating again from normal activities. The victim would have reduced range of motion, chronic pain, weakness in the affected limbs for the rest of their life. Spinal injuries from the rack were particularly devastating. Damage to the spinal cord could cause permanent paralysis. Even less severe spinal injuries led to chronic back pain, numbness or tingling in extremities, difficulty walking or standing for extended periods. In an era when most work was physical labor, these disabilities could make earning a living impossible. Breaking wheel survivors, if any existed, faced catastrophic injuries. Multiple broken bones throughout the body needed to heal, and medieval bone setting was primitive at best. Bones often healed at wrong angles, leaving legs of different lengths, arms that didn't straighten properly, ribs that healed misshapen and restricted breathing. The pain from these mal-healed injuries was constant. Before modern pain management, chronic pain was simply something you endured. Every movement hurt. Every breath could hurt if ribs were broken. Sleep was difficult. The physical suffering continued long after the torture chamber doors closed. Burn survivors faced their own challenges. Scar tissue is tight and inflexible. Burns that crossed joints could contract as they healed, drawing the joint into a fixed position that couldn't be straightened. A burned hand might heal into a claw. A burned face might be pulled into a permanent grimace. These contractures were both painful and disfiguring. Severe burns also caused loss of sensation. Nerve endings destroyed by heat don't regenerate. Burn victims might have patches of skin with no feeling, making them vulnerable to further injury that they wouldn't notice until it became serious. They might have lost fingers or toes to infection or gangrene after burns.
The social consequences of disfiguring torture were as significant as the physical ones. Medieval society placed people into rigid hierarchies and roles. Someone who emerged from torture visibly damaged, limping, scarred, missing digits, they were marked as criminal or heretic in a way that couldn't be hidden. Finding work became extremely difficult. Begging might be their only option. Some torture survivors were released back into society, either because they confessed and served their punishment, or because they were found innocent, or because someone intervened on their behalf. These people had to reintegrate into communities that had witnessed or heard about their torture. They carried not just physical scars, but the stigma of having been tortured. Others remained imprisoned after torture, held until trial or execution. For them, torture was just the beginning of a longer ordeal. Prison conditions were appalling. Dungeons were cold, damp, dark. Prisoners were given minimal food, often bread and water only. Disease spread easily in close quarters. Many prisoners died in custody before ever facing trial. The psychological impact of torture is harder to document from historical records because medieval people didn't have modern concepts of psychological trauma. But the signs were there. Records mention people who never spoke again after torture, who developed what we'd now call selective mutism. Others showed signs of what we'd recognize as depression, withdrawing from social contact,
showing no interest in activities they previously enjoyed. Post-traumatic stress was absolutely a reality for torture survivors, even if they didn't have that term for it. Recurring nightmares, hyper-startle responses, inability to be in dark or enclosed spaces, panic attacks triggered by sounds or smells associated with their torture, all of these would have affected survivors. Without any form of therapy or treatment, these psychological wounds festered. The ripple effects extended to families. If a household's primary earner was tortured and left disabled, the entire family suffered. Children might have to take on work early. Wives might have to become breadwinners in a society that didn't make that easy. The social shame of having a family member tortured could affect everyone's prospects. Some torture survivors became advocates against the practice, though speaking out was dangerous. A few wrote accounts of their experiences, like John Gerard, who we mentioned earlier. These first-hand accounts are invaluable historical sources, showing us torture not as abstract horror, but as experienced by real individuals who somehow found words to describe the indescribable. The ending of judicial torture in Europe was gradual and uneven. It happened at different times and different places, driven by various factors. The Enlightenment brought new ideas about human rights and the unreliability of torture-extracted confessions. Cesare Beccaria's 1764 essay on crimes and punishments argued influentially against torture, pointing out that it punished the innocent who couldn't endure pain, while potentially letting the guilty but strong go free. Various jurisdictions began restricting, then eliminating judicial torture through the 18th and 19th centuries. Prussia abolished torture in 1740, though with exceptions. France ended it officially in 1780. Austria in 1776. Britain had mostly phased it out even earlier. By 1900, judicial torture was officially banned throughout Europe, though extrajudicial torture and torture in colonial contexts continued. The elimination of torture was part of broader criminal justice reforms that moved away from corporal punishment generally. Prisons became the primary means of punishment, replacing public tortures and executions. This shift wasn't entirely humane. Prison conditions were often horrific, but it represented changing ideas about the body, punishment, and state power.
Today, museums across Europe house collections of medieval torture devices. The Tower of London displays its rack. The Medieval Crime Museum in Rotenburg ob der Tauber, Germany, has an extensive collection. These museum displays serve multiple purposes. They educate about historical realities. They satisfy morbid curiosity. They serve as reminders of humanity's capacity for cruelty. They prompt questions about justice, power, and suffering. Walking through these exhibits produces complicated reactions. There's horror at what these devices were used for, fascination with the ingenuity, however misapplied, of their design, discomfort with our own interest, gratitude for living in times when such practices are condemned. These emotional responses are all valid and important. Museums handle torture devices in different ways. Some present them clinically, with detailed explanations of how they worked and historical contexts for their use. Others create more atmospheric displays, with dim lighting and sound effects, trying to evoke the terror of the torture chamber. Both approaches have merit and problems. Too clinical, and they become mere curiosities. Too atmospheric, and they risk trivializing or sensationalizing real suffering. Modern scholarship on medieval torture has evolved significantly. Early historians often exaggerated the prevalence and cruelty of medieval torture, fitting into narratives of progress where the past was barbaric and the present enlightened. More recent scholarship has been more nuanced, examining who was tortured, why, how often, under what legal frameworks,
With what results? We now know that torture wasn't uniformly applied across medieval Europe. Some regions and periods used it heavily. Others relied on it less. It wasn't a constant throughout the medieval period, but increased significantly during the late medieval Inquisition and continued into the early modern period. The worst excesses, like witch trial tortures, peaked after the medieval period proper. The legal restrictions on torture that did exist, however frequently violated, show that even medieval societies recognized torture as problematic. The fact that authorities felt the need to justify and regulate it suggests discomfort with the practice. This doesn't excuse anything, but it complicates simplistic narratives about medieval barbarism versus modern civilization. Why study this dark subject? Several reasons. First, historical understanding requires confronting uncomfortable truths. Medieval torture was real. It affected real people's lives. It shaped societies and legal systems. Ignoring it because it's unpleasant would leave our understanding of the past incomplete. Second, studying torture helps us understand how societies can normalize atrocity. The same psychological and social mechanisms that made medieval torture acceptable can operate in any era. Understanding how ordinary people participated or accepted torture then helps us recognize warning signs in our own times and contexts. Third, torture's history isn't as past as we might like to think. Throughout the 20th and into the 21st century, torture has been practiced, sometimes officially, sometimes covertly, by governments claiming to be civilized. Understanding historical torture provides context for ongoing debates about enhanced interrogation, detention without trial, and treatment of prisoners generally. Fourth, the study raises fundamental questions about justice, punishment, and state power. What gives authorities the right to cause suffering? How do we prevent abuse of that power? How do we balance safety and rights? These questions faced medieval societies too, and their attempts to answer them, however flawed, inform ongoing debates. The trauma of torture extends across generations in ways we're still discovering. Communities that experienced mass torture events, whether medieval inquisitions or more recent atrocities, carry that trauma in their collective memory. Stories passed down, fears encoded in culture, wariness of authority, all can persist long after the physical torture chambers have been demolished. Survivors who managed to speak about their experiences described the importance of witnessing, of having their suffering acknowledged. Being able to name what happened to them, to have it recognized as wrong, helped with psychological recovery. This insight informs modern approaches to trauma therapy and transitional justice after atrocities. The medieval period's lack of support for torture survivors left wounds that never healed. Without therapy, without pain management, without social support systems, survivors struggled alone with physical and psychological consequences. This abandonment compounded the initial trauma, making survival even harder. Modern understanding of torture's ineffectiveness for gathering reliable intelligence was something even some medieval authorities recognized, at least implicitly. The fact that confessions extracted under torture could be recanted, that people would say anything to stop pain, was known. Yet the practice continued because it served other purposes: social control, deterrence, reinforcing hierarchies, punishing the deviant. If we've learned anything from studying medieval torture, it should be humility about our own times. It's easy to look back and feel superior to medieval people who used such cruel methods. It's harder to examine how our societies treat prisoners, how we justify suffering when it's labeled necessary for security, how we might be participating in or accepting practices that future generations will judge harshly. The devices themselves, the wheels and racks and thumbscrews gathering dust in museums, are less important than the systems that created and employed them.
Torture wasn't individual sadism, it was institutional, legal, normal. Understanding how institutions can normalize suffering, how legal frameworks can justify cruelty, how ordinary people can participate in extraordinary evil, these lessons remain urgently relevant. As we close this journey through medieval torture's history, we're left with difficult questions and no easy answers. We've seen humanity at some of its worst, seen what people can do to each other when given permission by authority and religion. We've seen suffering that's hard to comprehend, cruelty that defies imagination, yet happened, really happened, to real people. The comfort we might take is that these practices ended, at least in their official forms, that humanity, however slowly, moved toward recognizing torture as unacceptable, that the Enlightenment values of human dignity and rights, however imperfectly applied, represent progress, that the horror we feel reading about medieval torture shows moral growth. But we should take discomfort too. Discomfort with how recently torture was normal, discomfort with how easily it could become normal again under the right pressures, discomfort with our own capacity, under the right circumstances, to participate in or accept cruelty when it's officially sanctioned and socially normalized. The medieval torture chamber is physically far from us, separated by centuries, but psychologically, socially, it might be closer than we'd like to think. The same human nature that built those devices and operated them lives in us. The same societal pressures that normalized torture then could normalize it again. Vigilance is required, always. So, remember the rack's victims, their arms pulled from sockets. Remember those broken on wheels, bones shattered systematically. Remember the burned, the crushed, the psychologically destroyed. Remember them not as statistics or historical curiosities, but as people who suffered, who felt every moment of their torture, who carried scars physical and psychological, whose voices mostly didn't survive to tell their own stories. Remember them as warning, as reminder, as call to ensure that the practices that destroyed them remain history, not repeated. As motivation to question our own time's practices, to resist normalization of suffering, to defend human dignity even when, especially when, it's inconvenient or frightening to do so. The torture chambers are empty now. The devices are silent. The screams have faded into history. But the questions they raise, the lessons they teach, the warnings they offer, these remain loud and urgent. Listen to them. Learn from them, and carry that knowledge forward, making sure that this particular darkness stays in the past where it belongs. So, as you drift off tonight, in your comfortable bed, with your painkillers and antibiotics and heating blankets and all the comforts of modern life, spare a thought for those who endured what we've discussed tonight. Not to wallow in their suffering, but to honor their humanity by refusing to forget. The medieval torture chamber teaches us that humans are capable of terrible things when we believe we have justification. It teaches us that systematic cruelty can become normal when authorities sanction it and societies accept it. It teaches us that progress isn't inevitable, that the protections we enjoy today required struggle and can be lost if we're not vigilant. But it also teaches us resilience, that people like Artemisia Gentileschi could maintain their truth even under thumbscrews, that survivors could rebuild lives from ruins, that the human spirit, while it can be broken, possesses remarkable capacity for endurance and recovery. Sleep well tonight, grateful for every mercy of modern life. And if you enjoyed this descent into historical darkness, if you appreciate these kinds of deeply researched, disturbing, but educational deep dives into history's worst moments, then please like the video and subscribe. Leave a comment about what historical topic you'd like me to cover next, though I make no promises it will be any cheerier than this one. Until next time, stay curious, stay grateful, and be thankful you live in an age where torture is condemned rather than legal. Though, as we've learned tonight, never assume the progress we've made is permanent or inevitable.
History's darkest chapters serve as warnings, not assurances. Good night.